Hi everyone, my name is Tim Harty, the Chief Executive of Mondaq, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's Voice of Global In-House Counsel webinar, hosted by Mondaq and In-House Counsel Worldwide, in partnership with Arthur Cox and Hewlett Packard. Today's webinar is titled From Compliance to Competence, Building Strong Governance in the Age of AI. For those of you who don't know, In-House Counsel Worldwide is a global network of member associations that represent the legal professionals who work as corporate counsel and or in-house counsel within companies or organizations. The primary mandate of In-House Counsel Worldwide is to unite this community globally to share practices, to share best practices, standardize competencies, promote standards and ethics, and collaborate to advance the sector of the legal profession for both the lawyers and their organizations. In the spirit of sharing best practices, this is the launch of Mondaq and In-House Counsel Worldwide's new series of Voice of Global In-House Counsel webinars and podcasts. On that note, it's a really great pleasure to introduce you to your hosts today, Nina Baraksai and Colin Rooney. Nina is Specialist Counsel, Global Privacy and Information Governance, Ethics and Compliance Office at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Nina works with cross-functional teams on a global basis to build sustainable governance and protection in the use of personal data. Nina sits on the AI Ethics Working Group, helping to embed privacy by design principles into our AI activities. Colin is head of the Technology and Innovation Group at Arthur Cox. He advises on data protection and privacy, information technology, outsourcing, cloud computing, and e-business matters. Colin has extensive experience advising domestic and international clients on information management issues, with his data protection and information technology practice covering all aspects of data processing across all industry sectors. His practice also has a strong emphasis on commercial IT agreements. Colin is a frequent speaker on data protection and freedom of information topics, including at the Data Protection Leadership Forum. He's also a frequent contributor to various legal journals on the above-mentioned topics. Today, Nina and Colin will be exploring the concept of AI literacy in the context of building effective compliance programs that go beyond basic legal requirements. We'll discuss how jurisdictions, including the EU, mandate strong governance, particularly in sectors like finance, healthcare, and corporate law, where directors and officers must demonstrate competency in AI-related issues. Before we begin today's webinar, just a quick housekeeping item. You're more than welcome to submit questions today by typing them into the control panel on the right-hand side of your page. We'll endeavor to answer as many of these questions as possible during the Q&A section towards the end of the webinar. Just so that you're aware, the format of today's session will be a moderated discussion format. So we'll try and keep the conversation flowing, keep you engaged with the audience. And in order to do that even more, we'll also be putting up a few poll questions. So if you could have a look at those and answer the poll questions when they come up, we'll be most grateful. I'm sure there'll be some learnings that come out of those for all of us. So without any further ado, Nina, I'd like to start with putting the following question to you. What does AI literacy mean when considering how to build a compliance program?
So I'm not the world expert on AI, and I think it would be very helpful to give us all a bit of a starting point. The Dutch Data Protection Authority has recently issued a really neat 4-page guide on how to approach AI literacy, how to think about AI. And I found that with all of the various detail around in the world, I thought that was a quite neat way to get started. It covers things like identification, setting goals, determining how you implement, and then doing some evaluations. And these things in themselves are quite scene setting. So as an organization, you may be very early in your journey for AI, or you may be well on the road. I think in each instance, if you set yourself a bit of a framework, a bit of a structure, it gives you a good starting point. And I thought it was neat that they could encapsulate it in 4 pages. So I've asked, Dan has thankfully put that link up into the chat. It's just a good start, and it doesn't blind you with science. It's not perfect, I'm sure. There'll be lots of other people who can do very pretty graphics, but this one was useful for me to start.
Thank you very much, Nina. So, going to put a first question, or second question rather, to Colin, and that is, how can organizations, Colin, effectively assign responsibility for AI-related data governance across functions such as IT, legal, privacy, and business teams? Over to you, Colin.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thank you to Mondaq for the invitation to attend and to present at today's seminar. Very interesting topic, and delighted to be accompanied by Nina on this. It's very interesting to be having this conversation. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that guidance from the Dutch authority is incredibly helpful. It's also incredibly useful because it's 4 pages, and anybody who has spent some time delving into guidance that comes out of Europe, particularly the EDPB, for example, knows that 4 pages is unusual. So I think it is a document that's certainly worth consulting and worth reviewing because there's some really good ideas. In terms of how organizations can assign responsibility for AI-related governance across a variety of functions, from IT to privacy to legal to finance, I think the key things to consider is around making sure you have a structured cross-functional approach to this. So trying to think about not necessarily getting to a level of compliance alone, and the Dutch document is very good on this, but thinking about how you get to a level of AI competence. And I think that features in terms of some of the things that Nina was leaning into in her initial response. AI literacy, I read as being very much around AI competence, making sure the right people in the organization understands to the extent possible what it is that they are dealing with, what this new technology is, what it can do, and what it's doing for your business, who it's impacting and how it's impacting them. In that regard, I think there are a couple of key steps that organizations can take in that context. The first is defining very clear governance roles, assigning AI responsible governance across a committee, and that committee having input from IT, from legal, from privacy, and from business teams. So everybody working together to feed into a committee so that there's governance at that level. I think what's equally vital in this regard is transparency around decision making, but also transparency around responsibility. Who has ownership within the organization? Who has responsibility for procurement, for example? Who has responsibility for rollout of the solution? Who has responsibility for testing of the solution? Not all of those responsibilities will sit with legal, not all will sit with the business. Some, maybe too many perhaps, might sit with privacy. We might come on and touch on that point later on. So I think that's a really important consideration as well. The third part of that I would really kind of ask the audience maybe to think about a little bit is vendor accountability. So thinking very carefully about the vendors that you are engaging. I thought the Dust report was really strong on this point. Thinking about the vendor, thinking what you're getting that vendor to do, thinking very clearly through, has that vendor done the necessary kind of tests that it's required to do? Has it done the impact assessments that are required? And has it presented to you a solution which is appropriately in compliance with the legislation? So I think that's how you try to bring it across all the different parts of the organization. A committee focusing on transparency and looking very closely at your vendors. As Nina has alluded to, the AI literacy piece is very important in the AI Act. We can see, for example, that from the 2nd of February, we have this AI literacy obligation in the EU AI Act. And that's a fairly clear obligation in terms of making sure individuals and staff in particular have a very clear understanding. And if you don't mind, I'm going to quote very briefly from what the legislation says. It says that to the best extent, a sufficient level of AI literacy of staff and other persons dealing with the operation and use of AI systems, taking into account their technical knowledge, experience, education, and training, and the context the AI systems are to be used in. So you can see it's a very broad sweep in terms of what that's asking an organization to do. And I think there's a lot of governance work that will have been done. And I've for many years have been a GDPR specialist, and maybe GDPR is a place that you can look to in terms of learning from that. But it's not the only place. There'll be expertise in procurement, there'll be expertise in finance, there'll be expertise in legal and other business units. And I think it's bringing that together to try and make sure that the relevant level of competence is achieved in relation to AI.
Can I add a few things in there, Tim, because Colin's kind of spread that discussion quite wide now. I think there's a UK government report, which Dan has the link for, but that talks about international AI safety. And there's the international piece, which suddenly becomes much more relevant when you're doing very large scale virtual activities, you need to have some context of how you do it across the globe. You won't necessarily have the ability to answer every single piece of legislation in every jurisdiction, in every type of sector or function or industry, but you do need to have some kind of overview, a helicopter view at least, and that government report is quite helpful. And then to pick up Colin's point about the training and the level of literacy, I was looking at Fosway, which does learning systems, and they've got a learning need for an AI roadmap. They've got a need for vendors to do training, and the vendors, particularly as Colin is describing, vendors are now struggling to create AI training. And Fosway has got a whole heap of material, so if you want to have a look, there's a link that Dan has. But the one thing that is relevant is there is now developing a kind of cadre of people who have some level of technology experience, and then others who have to implement it. So a very interesting statistic as we come towards International Women's Day: women are 16% less likely than men to use AI tools. 28% of AI training enrollments are women, and women make up less than a third of AI professionals. So yes, we've got all to upskill on AI and AI literacy, but we need to think about that overall governance, that overall spread of knowledge, and how it then becomes applicable. And that's not one or other jurisdiction. That is an AI kind of, it's not quite a revolution, but it's a drive to make business more competitive, more efficient, more effective, and more consistent, whilst running at 70 miles an hour down the motorway. If you can do 70 miles an hour with an electric car, it's likely to be much faster. So, all of these things, sorry, Colin, I had to, but all of these things bring together AI literacy. It's no longer, I have to know how something works. It's, I have to know how it works. I have to be transparent to explain it to other people, and then I have to move it forward, because if I don't, we won't keep up, but we also won't be productive and competitive in a very global real market. So I think all of those things make AI literacy suddenly not just a nice to have, it's a requirement. But to make it work, you have to make it work for your organization, for your activities, and there is where the excitement comes, because you can make it relevant to you.
All right, thank you very much, Nina and Colin, for those thoughts. Let's go to our first audience poll question. And if any of you are wondering, Dan is not an international man of mystery. He's the gentleman who is the producer of our webinar today. So Dan is going to get the poll up, and there it is.
I find these polls so interesting because not everybody is kind of at full stretch, but a lot of people are using tools that can have an element of AI. And once you get access to it, you can see how much it makes a difference. So we're talking about, moving from compliance to governance. That approach around transparency, that activity to drive use of the tools becomes quicker when you see how useful it can be. And I think that's quite an important thing. So, before you may not have had time or energy to put into this kind of activity. As soon as you see its value, that need becomes less of a need and more of a wish.
Can I come in briefly on this as well? Because I think it's interesting that so few people have said yes to having a plan at this point in time. I mean, this is going to sound like a peculiar thing to say, but I think that's a good thing that people have not said yes at this point in time. And if you think about it from just in terms of, say, the major piece of legislation that's making its way through the EU AI Act, the relevant obligations around AI literacy only took effect last month. They only took effect at the beginning of February. So it would be very early to have a plan, I think, to say, oh, we know how we're going to build AI literacy across our organization. I think now is probably the right moment. The majority of the AI obligations don't take effect until August of 25 of this year, and in some cases, August of next year. So you have some time to do this. And I think Nina drew this point out really well. You really do have to make sure you're doing it, you're tailoring it to your organization, you're tailoring it to the relevant employees, the relevant contractors, you're giving some consideration to your vendors. So I wouldn't be overly concerned. When I saw the poll, I think the fact that a small number have a plan doesn't mean that that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think now is probably, give or take, the right moment to be developing that plan and putting it in place. And maybe the year 25 is the year to be kind of rolling that plan out.
Well, can I add one more thing, which is perhaps the other side of this equation? There is a study that was done by, I think, Carnegie and Microsoft, where they said, look, if you use AI too much, you become lazy and dull because you let the machine do it. So, yes, you might have a training program. No, you might not. Maybe you're working on it. Always remember that the machine can influence how you behave, and if you're fully stretched and you're exposed and you've got lots of things to do and the AI will make it quicker, great. But always bear in mind that point that Colin raised about transparency. Explain it, make sure you know what's going on, human in the loop, accept that things may not quite be as perfect in AI land as they could be, and you need to make sure your head does some of the thinking, because the excitement is there, the opportunity is there, but there have to be some guardrails, and that's where the governance comes in. Humans, people will have some kinds of reactions. They may not always be perfect, but you do need to have that counterbalance.
All right.
I think Dan has another link for that particular study I was talking about as well.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, next question for our hosts, and I'm going to direct this one to Nina in the first instance, is how do you balance the need for centralized AI governance while maintaining agility and innovation in AI-driven teams?
So I found this a really interesting question to prepare, that the need for central versus balance and innovation is always going to be based on your business. You have to determine why you are using AI and what you're aiming to get out of it. It's no good saying, oh, I've got this fabulous tool, let's see what it can do. If you don't go into it with some kind of expectation of outputs or results or impact, you're not going to have much effect. So then when you think central versus innovation and regional or other groupings, you're not going to be able to say why you've put the investment into this enormously powerful capability. So it's really quite important to set those targets, those aims, those objectives, those commercial realities, to then decide, okay, do I really need to have this at a global level with one decision, or do I want to allow variations and maybe pilot studies, or maybe groups of people who try different things and then you come together? There's many groupings where you have, I think they're called hackathons, and you have people come together in controlled environments where they think with each other and come up with fabulous things. Equally, if you have lots of different people doing different things all around the world, and you realize that they're all duplicating, you've wasted an enormous amount of resource. It's always going to be that balance of how much money do we spend, what brains are we going to apply to it, but what are we going to use it for? If you don't know, then maybe you should be thinking about, this is going to be an experiment and we can fail quickly and safely. I think in some business activities, what you have is things like fast track. You know you're going to use some kind of experimental process. You'll put some minimum guardrails around that so that they run and they can run fast. If it falls over, you haven't damaged anything significant. Where you're applying it to production or commercial reality or with customers or clients or significant activities, the guardrails are going to be quite different. They're going to be careful. You're going to be measured. Exactly as Colin said, you don't have this running fast if it's not tested, because you don't know what the impact will be if it doesn't work. And that's not a perfect answer, central versus local versus innovation. But in business, AI is no different to any other new activity. Businesses will do this all over the place. So why is AI going to be different? Why would you have less control over a risky approach? You wouldn't. You'd do exactly the same due diligence for your business.
Can I come in on that? I think that those last few remarks, in particular from Nina, is really good counsel for thinking about AI as being like anything else new that your business would do. How would you risk categorize a new thing, a new business line that a new product or a new service that your organization was proposing to roll out. I think one thing in the context of thinking about centralized AI governance versus making sure you are sufficiently agile and allowing for innovation is to think about the fact that most of the legislation that we've seen, not just in Europe, further afield as well, is risk-based. It's asking you to make some determinations based upon the level of risk arising from the system. So if you think about the EU AI Act, it has risk qualifications and it has certain rules for high-risk AI and certain other rules for lower-risk AI. I think in particular, in terms of centralized AI governance, if you have a high-risk system or a system that falls into that categorization, that probably does need to be very centrally managed. And that is one where you need to be really careful in terms of, yes, you need innovation, but you need to make sure that you are making and meeting the requirements around risk assessments, around transparency, around notifications to regulators, etc. I think there's a potential, though, to be a little bit less centralized, maybe a little bit more innovative and more free, perhaps, in relation to what I would describe as being low risk or lower risk AI. Perhaps in those circumstances, the baseline level of centralized governance can be a little bit lower. So I would always, in my mind, be thinking about the risk allocation, the risk categorization. The high risk stuff, the high risk systems are absolutely one that I think really do need that centralized look. But I think when you're dealing with something which is lower risk, perhaps that does allow for greater levels of flexibility. And the legislation does allow for flexibility, and it also maybe perhaps allows for greater levels of innovation. One additional point which I think is important is the kind of ongoing monitoring. That's a really important piece of this as well. So, you get a new shiny toy, it's introduced into the business, it's rolled out, the business guys love it, the legal guys have their eyes covered, they're all very nervous about what it can and can't do. Privacy are looking the other way because it's just too much to take on. And there's a sense that, well, that's got through the system, it's got through the procurement, and it's up and running, and that's no longer our responsibility. I think that's one of the greatest risks around AI, that you introduce it, but you don't monitor how it is used within the business on an ongoing basis. That's where I think you can run into some challenges and some difficulties. So I would see this as being a centralized governance process for certain types of AI, but an overall governance process in terms of the longer term use of these solutions and making sure there's not scope creep in terms of what they're doing, making sure they're not going into areas where they're making decisions, particularly in relation to individuals, and there's no sufficient human oversight or there's no transparency. So the ongoing monitoring, I would regard as being a key component. It doesn't necessarily have to stifle innovation, but it's something which you do need that sort of assessment to be happening on an ongoing basis.
So one of the things that I think many organizations are doing is creating a kind of framework of ethical principles on how they will apply AI. And that goes to privacy principles, it goes to human rights principles. It's a really helpful way of doing governance in an innovative space, because you don't know the answers, you don't know the scope. And so if you can set a conceptual framework, then people from various disciplines can make it their own and work with it. How do you explain to an engineer how to do AI? He or she has got a whole range of things that they have to make sure will work. But if you go to a procurement person, how does that procurement person work with AI when they're trying to acquire new services? They have their own areas of expertise. So I do think if you can set that structural framework, that compliance piece then allows you to move through the governance piece into implementation and operation. It also means that you can move forward in an organizational space, and that's critical.
I'm just going to jump in and make that is in relation to the European Commission's, what they describe as, and I think this is a neatly described, living repository of AI literacy. So they have a best practices document which gives you a sense of how you might do this. Now, the European Commission in some respects is a fantastic institution, in other respects can be, sometimes a little bit slow to evolve. But I found in consulting this document and preparing for today's webinar a very useful source actually of information. It's not overly long, it's not 4 pages like the Dutch guidance, but it runs through about 40 pages or so. And it is full of, I think, useful ideas in terms of how you can make governance work around AI in the context of different business sectors. So again, I would regard that as being potentially a useful place to start if you're looking for some information or some guidance in terms of how you might move forward.
Right. Thank you very much, Nina and Colin. Interestingly, we actually had a question in whilst you were talking around those areas from an audience member called Alia, who said, what role can governance play in innovation with AI? And I think actually you've hit some really good use cases around that sort of the guide rail approach to lower risk AI, letting it run, obviously taking a centralized approach to higher risk tools. But any other thoughts, Nina and Colin, you might have? We always like to bring our audience into the role of governance in innovation with AI.
I mean, governance becomes, in a sense, a bit of a stick if you misuse it. I think when you are innovating, if you're doing it responsibly, you want to do the right thing, but you don't want to be stifled. If you're doing the wrong things, then you're not going to pay attention to governance. You're not going to pay attention to any guardrails. So, you take the approach with most people who are willing to do innovation, that they have a neat idea. They're creatives. They want to move forward on how they do something splendid and sparkling. The governance has to be practical and doable. That's the piece for me. How do you make sure that the governance works? That if you've got a great idea, that you can enable somebody to come up with their creativity. And creativity isn't, I've painted something beautiful. It could be, I've thought of this fabulous process where I can ingest lots of information and put out a neater process that saves me 40% of my activity. That's creative in a certain environment. And I think that innovation, we have to allow ourselves that opportunity to not think there's the risk that you can become groupthink. AI tells me I'm going to have a great idea, and then you don't have one, and you think, oh, I'm a vegetable. Or you can say, I'm not really going to pay attention to all of the other ways people look at it. I'm going to use my own thinking to see if I can make the tools do something that I want to do. And if I can't do it, I'll try and tweak it a little bit. I always think when you're talking about innovation, how did the person who thought up a round wheel come up with it instead of a square wheel? They must have applied something. AI is not at all like a round or a square wheel, but there must be those equivalents when you're using tools. People create tools because they want to do something, and AI is enabling that. So there is where I think the governance helps you. When you're creating a tool, if you make a chisel, you try and make sure you use a face guard so chips don't fly into your face. AI, there must be those kinds of things that you put to protect you from bad things happening by accident.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Nina. Right, let me go to the next host question. We're going to do a poll just after this, audience poll. I'm going to go Colin first, and this is around the context within which we're working with evolving regulations like GDPR and even more so the EU AI Act. How can organizations future-proof their AI compliance strategies, if they even can? Colin.
Yeah, I'm glad, Tim, you said if they even can at the end, because that's the most important part of the question, I think. Right? Yes, there's some degree of future-proofing that you can do, okay? And where I think I'm kind of loath to use the word mistake, but I think in a kind of an error that organizations can sometimes fall into, and it's understandable, is they get lost in the black letter of the legislation. They get lost in the granular detail of legislation, whether that's European, US, Asia Pac, wherever it happens to be, okay? I think if you want to future-proof your compliance program, your governance program, to take account of whatever piece of legislation is moving through, wherever you think it's going in relation to AI, I think it's important that you understand the macro level obligations. So, for example, much like GDPR and the AI legislation are quite different. So I think data protection and AI, there's a lot of similarities in relation and overlaps in relation to, for example, how you might do governance. But what's actually being governed, what's actually being sort of, if you like, policed or regulated, is actually are two quite different things, right? So, but I think you can learn something from that compliance. And what you can learn, for example, is with AI, and Nina alluded to this, there's often a number of foundational principles. And so what do I mean by foundational principles? I mean issues like, for example, transparency. So am I telling individuals how I am using the AI system? Is there an understanding within the organization as regards what it can do and what it is doing? And have affected individuals has that been explained to them? Have they been, for want of a better word, notified about that? Is there accountability? Do I have ownership of this? Have I done the appropriate testing? Have I done the appropriate impact assessments? Have I made the appropriate filings, if any, with the relevant regulator? Am I confident that I understand where I sit in terms of my general legal obligations around the use of that system? And the legal obligations, and I'm very keen to get this point across, may not be primarily privacy obligations. They may be obligations from a health and safety perspective. They may be obligations from a financial law perspective. They may be obligations in relation to competition or antitrust matters. So there's a whole bunch of different issues that can arise. And I would sort of say to think broadly in that regard, right? Don't get too lost in the granular detail. Think wide. Security is an absolutely important, like vital component to think about in relation to making sure your compliance program is future-proofed. And finally, I think fairness. The one thing I would think that a regulator in any AI context, whether in Europe or the United States or Canada or Asia Pac, is going to focus in on very quickly is the idea of fairness. Is there bias? Is there discrimination? Is there an individual who is negatively somehow impacted by how the system is proposing to proceed? So if you are dealing with those foundational principles, and you may not have got it entirely correct, and the position in relation to how those foundational principles are interpreted will evolve over time. It'll evolve through the courts. It'll evolve through national legislation in different countries. But overall, those principles are not likely to change fundamentally. They are foundational. They are the kind of building blocks under which the legislation is operating. I think that's a good way to future-proof. Another suggestion, if there's time, is just to maybe engage with regulators. Now, when I say engage with regulators, sometimes clients or people that I present to or speak to will sort of stand back and say, "Oh, do we really want to engage with a regulator? That sounds like a kind of a risky strategy." I think in certain circumstances it can be a risky strategy, but if you want to get a sense of the direction of travel of compliance, if you want to get a sense in the jurisdictions that are relevant to you, how you think compliance is going to develop, the two probably most likely sources driving the compliance journey will be the attitude of the regulator, what the regulator proposes to enforce, what they're focused on, what they think is important to get into the market, and to a certain extent the courts. Very difficult to engage with the courts unless you're in litigation, and that's a whole different thing, not for today. But you can engage with regulators. I find generally, certainly European regulators, and my experience with regulators in North America, for example, is that they are to a certain extent open to engaging. Certainly there are mechanisms to do that. So I would focus very much on the foundational principles, and I would think about the extent to which I can learn from and perhaps even engage with regulators, because that's going to allow me to anticipate some of the big changes that may happen in relation to how particular legislation is enforced or how a compliance program may need to develop.
I've just provided to Dan, there's a link from the EDPB where they talked about algorithmic discrimination under the AI Act and GDPR. So exactly as Colin described, the regulators are working hard to try and navigate some of this material. I think the other piece, there's some questions around a universally accepted definition of AI and different regulatory approaches. There are regulators being stood up around the world. There's also a bit of a land grab by regulators to decide who is going to be the AI regulator in their jurisdiction. So I think some of those things will, of course, shake out as the responses of various jurisdictions come into play. I think, for coming back to the very beginning of Colin and I's discussion, you have to make it work for your organization and for your business and your activity, and you have to be mindful of what the impact is in your environment, because the regulators they've got to do their own school report. They've also got to help their own jurisdictions. They've got to help their own kind of economies. But the business will be global in certain instances, and they'll have to operate globally depending on your scale and the impact of your AI activities. So you can't wait. You can't wait for one regulator to come out with a perfect answer or another one to come out with a not perfect answer. You're still going to have to move forward in the framework of the legislation that you have, but make it work commercially, because all of these things have a cost, an impact, an opportunity, as well as a cost. So from my perspective, when you're doing things like privacy, and Colin talked about it quite eloquently before, you have to think about, well, what's the practicalities of it for our business, for our activity? And that's where the in-house counsel becomes kind of critical, because they have to be able to navigate. And it's that innovation and navigation within your context. I was at a conference last year where there was a team talking about medical instruments and how the AI Act and legislation applies to medical instruments. I'm not in that sector, but it's a vast array of things that they have to consider. And if you're doing a medical instrument, you have to make sure it works. You can't not make it work. So your need to drive through the legislation to your device and get it approved by the various regulatory authorities will force you to reach a conclusion that you can operate. Not that's perfect, but that you won't, for example, harm anyone. That's critical. And the innovation won't stop you, but you will be mindful of all of those things when you do your activity. And so, in a sense, your businesses are navigating the AI just as much as the regulators are.
Thank you.
There was a question, I think, from Lucinda asking about the innovation piece. And one thing that just struck me is I think the lack of a global definition won't stop the advance of AI. But what it may mean is that different AI is available in different ways in different jurisdictions. So, for example, I'm aware before we even get to AI, from a privacy perspective, certain things will be released in different jurisdictions in North America that are not permissible or can't make it into the market in the EU. So I think that's where we end up, to kind of try to answer that question. We don't end up in a situation where the innovation stops. I think we end up in a situation where some of the fruits of the innovation are maybe not available in different jurisdictions depending upon the different rules that may arise or apply. So that's maybe where the legislation impacts the user perhaps more than it impacts the provider or the deployer, if that makes some sense.
Thank you very much, Nina and Colin. Okay, let's get the second audience poll up. Dan, please. And I'm expecting a low response here because not a lot of people have training in place based on the first question. So, well, there we go. Okay. I've got a few more people coming. Good, good, good. We'll let that flow. And I'll leave it to Nina and Colin to provide some commentary.
So I'm finding it very interesting that there's general training as a lead and specific is lower, because when you are in a business where you have to have AI in place because it's working and you're using it in kind of commercial frontline activities, it feels from this that the specific training is already well past and you're now operating it, whereas the general are for people who are just dipping their toe and trying to work out where they might want to use AI, because they're giving people, in a sense, that the helicopter view, the structure, the framework within which to operate. So this is really encouraging, because it's going back to Colin's comment earlier about only 4% have a training program. You shouldn't rush into these things because they won't be worth it. I think this is a very helpful kind of summary. So I'm glad. Thank you for those who voted.
Totally agree with that. I don't have enough to add other than to say I think it's heartening that it's general rather than specific. I think that's the way it should be. That is your general obligation around explaining how the AI works, what your statutory obligations are, making sure the right people have the right knowledge. I think by necessity it would have to be general for the moment. Maybe some organizations are further on in that journey, and that's why there is a sort of a 20% on the specific side, but largely agree. I don't largely, fully agree with Nina. I think this is not surprising. It's probably the right mix in terms of what we would expect to see right now.
Okay, thank you. Right, next host question is directed at Colin. In your mind and experience, Colin, what's the biggest compliance blind spot when integrating AI into business operations? And a kind of a follow-on from that, where do organizations most often fall short in aligning AI development with privacy and regulatory expectations? Over to you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Tim. Okay, I think these questions, the second question sort of relates very closely to my answer to the first question, right? So for me, and I kind of alluded to this point earlier, the biggest blind spot is assuming AI, and in particular your legal obligations around AI, are somehow very closely tied to your data protection, data privacy, GDPR, CCPA, whatever it happens to be, obligations. They're not. They are two different things which sometimes speak to each other, but that is a real blind spot. Okay. So if you were implementing a new, and I really liked what Nina said at the outset of this webinar, if you were introducing a new piece of technology into your business, if you were rolling out a new product, if you were developing a new service, you would not think about that purely through the lens of privacy. You would think about that through the lens of your general legal obligations. You would think about product liability. You might think of your service standards. You might think of things in relation to what general ISO standards and things like that. For some reason with AI at the moment, particularly in the European context, it seems to be incredibly tightly tied to privacy considerations. Privacy is a big consideration, but it's sometimes not it's often not the only consideration. It's generally not the only consideration, but sometimes not even the biggest consideration, right? So, for example, safety standards might be a really important consideration. Product liability may be a really important consideration. Liability may be a massively important consideration. So that's a blind spot that I think organizations should sort of check themselves. Don't ignore all the good work, particularly the good work you may have done in terms of your privacy compliance program. You can take a lot from that, and you can lend it into, for example, your AI governance program. But don't assume they're the same thing. They overlap, but they're not the same thing. The other thing which I think I've seen, and it may be because of where we are in the AI life cycle, is I think both Nina and I touched on this point, is that when I'm going to describe it as being an over-reliance or having too much confidence in your AI vendor, thinking that your AI vendor has done all the diligence that they should have done, that they're selling you a solution that is fully compliant, that the solution is something that meets all the requirements. Yes, under the EU legislation, providers and deployers have various different obligations. But I think if you're bringing a piece of technology into your business, it is beholden on you to sort of assess what that technology does, how legally compliant it is, what risks it's creating, what potential liabilities are arising from the use of that technology. So that's a really important piece from my perspective. A future blind spot, I don't see too much of it now, the one which I think is coming down the line is the lack of explainability. I'm sorry, I can't explain. The AI is a black box. Not sure what it does. That's certainly in Europe. That's not going to work. You will need to have a reasonably clear understanding. You don't need to understand at a super granular level exactly what it does, but you need to understand, what did you buy the solution to do? What is it designed to do? Is it doing that in your business, or is the scope creeping? Is it doing other things? Is it moving into a space where you thought you were a deployer, but now you're a provider? Are you doing add-ons to the solution? There's loads of different situations that can arise where if you don't understand what you are buying and how you are using what you have bought, that can be a real risk. And then finally, and I have some sympathy for organizations about this. There are so many different risk assessments required. So there's a DPIA under GDPR, and there are various different assessments required under sort of the various different the privacy legislation across the world, where Asia Pac, North America. There's, I think about in financial services, we've had recently obligations around DORA from a cybersecurity perspective. That there's lots of assessments required, right? I think that sometimes your assessments can, by necessity, because they involve different individuals, different people looking at things from different perspectives, they can end up coming to inconsistent conclusions. Okay, so I think that's really a risk for an organization. If you have documents and the documents are all looking at the same thing but in a slightly different way, you can reach a different conclusion, and that can result in some challenges if, for example, a regulator looks at the issue, or in certain jurisdictions where private rights of action might be a risk. You can have the situation where you might see an individual make a claim, they might get discovery, and they might see different conclusions being reached in relation to the same technology or the same solution based upon who's looking at it and through what prism they are looking at it. So that would, for me, be the blind spots, I think, in relation to AI and integration into businesses.
I think some of the other things to bear in mind also, things are fine when everything's fine. If nothing goes wrong, nobody really has an issue. In the privacy space, obviously, if you have incidents, everybody is all hands to the pump, and you try your hardest to fix and mitigate and resolve and address and close down exposure. If you don't know quite what the exposure is, it's going to be hard to close it down. In AI, if you can't explain how the exposure arose, you're going to have even harder a task to try and mitigate it. So some of those things around, being responsible and resilient and reactive may not be quite so simple if you don't quite know what's going on. I think the other piece, and particularly on vendors, everybody really wants to be able to say they're selling the best solution, the best product, the best output, the best service. And so they will be working their own products hard to try and make them better. If you are constantly using relationships and partnerships with other organizations, then you may not always know where they have enhanced their product or where they have enhanced their capability through AI. And they may also not know that something that was quite an innocent amendment or enhancement has had a massive knock-on impact elsewhere across the world as they've applied an AI kind of solution, and it then has a ripple effect. And many organizations use the same large-scale tools like, payroll solutions and customer management solutions and database handling, and the list is endless. If they're all being amended and enhanced by AI capabilities, and that has a knock-on effect globally, you may not actually know where it's manifesting. And so some of those guardrails, some of those kind of frameworks and principles and risk management processes that you have for any of your activities may be the things keeping you within that safe space to the best of your possible ability. And I don't point any fingers at any particular vendors, because that would be quite inappropriate. But, we're all in the world of kind of economies and commerce trying to do better. And I think that's something that is, in a sense, an unintended consequence, where you are all trying to do well, all aiming at directions that are relevant for your business. You have to be mindful of that wider possible effect. When did faxes stop and they got taken over by emails? It's a very, very silly example, but if you ask somebody now about a fax, they won't quite know how to do one. But everybody would know how to do email. But if you're using Bluetooth, you don't send emails anymore, and you might use chat. I'm a dinosaur. You can probably tell my technology knowledge is low, but those are the kinds of changes that AI is driving us towards with excitement and enthusiasm. But those things may not be fully understood now compared to 5 years, 10 years time.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Colin. Now, Colin, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm not going to ask you the exact question that Rory's put, because it involves potentially, mentioning companies, vendors that might be of merit to explore. But there's something in Rory's question that I wanted to put to you. There are a lot of vendors selling tools that guarantee AI compliance with global laws. Is that even possible, Colin?
No, no, it was my simple answer. I was wondering if you were going to ask me this, Tim, and I was wondering how to be diplomatic in my answer, right? So let me say a couple of things. I think, and another comment earlier, or a question earlier, kind of alluded to this in terms of innovation. It's very difficult to get any guarantee that you're globally and you're going to be in compliance with all the global laws, because they're not a jigsaw that nicely fits together. They are a little bit of a mess, an overlapping mess, and they're all moving in generally the same direction, but often they're doing it in different ways. Sometimes they're very principles based. Sometimes they are, sort of much more like an executive order. Sometimes it's much more specific and it's only dealing on a sectoral basis. Sometimes it's got general application. So I don't believe generally, and I mean, like, I'm an outside counsel. Be good to hear, I think, from Nina, from her perspective on this as well. But I'm generally loath to endorse solutions that say, I will deliver for you a guarantee of compliance across a bunch of global legal obligations, because the obligations, as I said, will be different, but also the underlying legal systems themselves will be different. Some cases common law, some cases civil law, some cases other legal systems altogether. So not being dismissive of any organizations in particular, I've got none in mind actually, but just the idea that you can sell that, I think, is something I would be very wary of. There are, however, solutions that you can look at which will give you a sense of what the kind of overlaps are. I think that's much more useful to say, well, actually, what's happening in the United States or Canada, it might be phrased differently, but it looks awfully like what might be happening in the UK or the EU. And I think that can be a very useful tool. But I'm maybe just I'm a conservative lawyer, but I'm very wary of guarantees.
So I've put in the chat, thank you, Dan, the statement that the Paris AI Action Summit issued on inclusive and sustainable AI for people and the planet. And that sounds very high, but there was a significant number of countries who signed up to that. And I think that's the direction of travel. It's that, we are going to state a number of kind of conceptual frameworks as a summit, and we expect that the planet will move along those lines. So any commercial activity will use that as a guidance, a kind of low North Star to aim towards. It's not perfect. It's what they came up with at the summit. I'm sure there will be more statements as the world grows deeper into its AI life, as it were. But I think, you have to start somewhere. Human beings are creative at any stage, and these things can be done together, they can be done separately. It's a timing issue. It depends what you want to do. I'm really of the view that there is a real excitement and opportunity, but it has to be tempered and managed. And there is where the governance comes in. This is why, yes, you have compliance. Yes, there are laws. Quite often the laws are created in a time frame, and the world has moved on before the law even gets passed. Nothing special or unusual. So how do we do it? We're still moving. And I think some of these things will be journeys as we move through them.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Colin. Now, we've got about 7 minutes left. And actually, the last question I was going to put to Nina in the first instance has already begun to be being addressed. But I'm still going to put it to you, Nina, just for any additional thoughts and also for Colin to come in. How do you navigate the challenge of conflicting global AI regulations when deploying AI across different markets? So maybe look at through the lens of current deployments. Have you found effective approaches to standardizing governance across jurisdiction? I'm going to go to you first, Nina. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the way that it is perhaps practical is you have to work out what you're trying to achieve. It's no point saying I'm going to put an AI solution across the globe to all jurisdictions because it has to be done this way. What is kind of almost more crucial is that people understand how they can present their thinking. How do they get their ideas together so that somebody like me who is not a technologist can understand what they're doing? Because that way, globally, you can then have an assessment within a certain structure and say, well, I can see this bit fits there and that bit fits there and this bit is unknown. So let's see if we can move forward with, at least 70% known, 30% unknown, and watch it carefully. There's Colin's point about monitoring. That is the approach right now. It's not to say it's perfect, or it will go kind of more reserved or conservative. And that's in any organization. I'm not kind of quoting one or other organization when I say that. This is how governance moves forward in any environment for any new thing. And because AI requires a lot of resource and a lot of expenditure, you will be cautious about how you do that globally because there is a cost. And I don't think AI is any different from that. It is the excitement, though, that the ideas that are coming forward globally are vastly different from one side of the globe to the other. And that brings the richness of it to the work. I don't think any one AI focused person would say that their day is the same as yesterday. It's not. They're forever coming up with things that they'd never even heard of or seen of 2 weeks ago. And I think that's the bit that, globally is the excitement, but it's also the challenge.
I really like Nina's answer. I really do like Nina's answer in the sense that I think this is very much about tailoring it to your organization, figuring out what it is that you're trying to achieve, because different organizations, depending upon their sectors and their business, will want to achieve different things. I think it's not possible to completely avoid conflicting AI regulations across the globe. And I spoke about that in response to my last answer. But I think there are certain things that you can do which can allow you to move your business along and get to a point where you can get to a place of practical compliance. I think the first thing I would say is having a kind of a core group of AI principles that you want to follow. Okay, so that are not sort of region specific and not sort of maybe statutory or kind of legislation specific. These are things which you think are relevant to your business because of the nature of what your business is. Some of these will be obvious: transparency, we talked about, accountability, lack of bias, sort of the appropriate human oversight, security. There's things which should be built in, right? I think then it's figuring out beyond that where you need to tailor for different regions. And I would try to avoid tailoring at a very low level. So I would try to see the world in sort of sectors and say, like, there's a kind of there's the EU, there's North America, there's parts of Asia Pac, there's other parts of Africa, there's other areas in which you can see things in a kind of broad sense. And then what I think you're trying to do in that context is look for the appropriate compliance standard. Sometimes that's the highest standard, depending upon what your business is, and other times it is a lower standard.
I think we just lost Colin.
Yeah, he froze and then he lost, and unfortunately it was during midpoint. Let's see, Colin, you're back. You were about to make a very important point.
But I can finish my train of thought, which was effectively to say, pick your regions and match your compliance to your regions. Go for the most appropriate compliance method, and sometimes that will be the highest, but not always, and then match it to your business. So along the lines of what I think Nina was alluding to, picking and making sure your sector is appropriate.
There's a question in the poll about 27001. I've put in ISO 42001 is one to consider on AI management systems. There are many. That's the one I've heard of. That's not to say it's the best or the worst, but that's the one I've heard of. So I think with this kind of thing, a voyage of exploration is perhaps a good thing to do.
I think there might have also been a question earlier on around the difference between high risk and low risk AI, and maybe just so we don't miss those questions. I mean, one where I would point you to in relation to examples of high risk AI is Annex 3 of the EU AI Act is a very good way of getting a sense of what might be considered to be high risk. And this doesn't sound like a very lawyery answer, but what's low risk is often what's outside of those categories. Assuming it's not prohibited AI, I'm assuming it's not in the high risk category, and it's not, for example, LLMs, well, then it may be in the context. A chatbot would be a thing we'd often consider to be, for example, probably low risk AI. So I appreciate that there's a lot in that, but that annex is a useful place in terms of understanding what the European Commission at least think is high risk artificial intelligence.
Thank you. Perfectly timed, 1 minute to the hour. A very, very big thank you to our host speakers today, Nina Baraksai and Colin Rooney. Thank you to all of our audience who dialed into the first of our new Voice of Global In-House Counsel webinars and podcasts. Thank you so much. We hope to see you again. Have a great day further.